Welcome back to Wayne's Archive. Step out of the blinding, chaotic noise of the modern metropolis and join me in the heavy, suffocating shadows of a city held hostage by an invisible phantom. If you are a new investigator joining our ranks, drawn to the unsolved, the terrifying, and the dark psychological abysses of human history, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, ring the notification bell, and anchor yourself to this archive. I also want you to descend into the comments below and let me know your thoughts as we unseal today's file. What drives a man to declare a one-man war against a city of 8 million people? Your theories and your engagement are the lifeblood of this channel. Without you, these dark corridors of history would remain permanently sealed. Today, we are opening a dossier that completely paralyzed the greatest city on Earth. We are traveling back to the mid-20th century, descending into the concrete canyons of New York City to track a phantom who didn't hunt in the dark woods, but struck in the most crowded, brightly lit public spaces imaginable. We are analyzing the 16-year reign of absolute terror orchestrated by the entity known only as the Mad Bomber. To understand the sheer, unprecedented scale of the panic that eventually consumed New York, we must first travel back to the genesis of the terror, to a time before the world was engulfed in the flames of the Second World War. The year is 1940. New York City is a booming, invincible titan of industry and commerce, a towering monument to human ambition. Millions of people flow through its underground arteries and towering skyscrapers every single day, completely oblivious to the fragile nature of their own safety. On the brisk afternoon of November 16th, 1940, that illusion of invincibility was quietly, subtly challenged. On the windowsill of the massive Consolidated Edison office building on West 64th Street, a custodian discovered a strange, heavy object. It was a crude piece of brass tubing, tightly packed with gunpowder, equipped with a primitive ignition mechanism. Wrapped securely around the pipe was a handwritten note, written in meticulous, blocky, almost mechanical capital letters. The message was chillingly direct. Con Edison Crooks, this is for you. By sheer luck, the primitive firing mechanism had failed. The bomb was a dud. When the New York Police Department's bomb squad arrived to dismantle the device, they treated the incident with a dangerous level of dismissive arrogance. To the hardened detectives of the NYPD, this was simply the work of a disgruntled, pathetic crank, perhaps an angry customer whose electricity had been shut off, or a terminated employee venting his frustration. They catalogued the brass pipe, filed the meticulously written note away in a dusty cabinet, and entirely forgot about the incident. They had absolutely no idea that this small, failed explosive was not an isolated act of anger, but the opening salvo of a protracted, deeply personal war. For months, the city remained completely silent. The police assumed the crank had simply moved on. But then, in September of 1941, a second explosive device was discovered, this time abandoned on the street merely a few blocks away from the main Consolidated Edison building on Irving Place. This bomb was also a dud, but its construction showed a terrifying evolution. The bomber was learning, refining his deadly craft in the shadows. Before the NYPD could even begin to launch a formal, coordinated investigation into these two mysterious devices, the entire world fundamentally shifted. In December of 1941, the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor, instantly dragging the United States into the devastating, all-consuming theater of World War II. The entire focus of the nation, and specifically the massive law enforcement apparatus of New York City, violently pivoted towards civil defense, blackouts, and the hunt for foreign saboteurs. The mysterious pipe bombs targeting a local utility company became a completely irrelevant afterthought. But shortly after the United States entered the global conflict, the NYPD received another letter, written in those exact same, highly distinctive, blocky capital letters. The message contained a bizarre, deeply unsettling declaration of patriotism from a terrorist. The Phantom wrote, "I will make no more bomb units for the duration of the war. My patriotic feelings have made me decide this. Later, I will bring the Con Edison to justice. They will pay for their dastardly deeds." The letter was signed with two simple, enigmatic initials, F.P. True to his terrifying, twisted word, the Phantom vanished. For 5 long years, while the world burned overseas, the streets of New York remained completely untouched by his malice. But the city was sitting on a ticking time bomb, and the moment the war ended, the countdown would resume. When the Second World War finally came to a triumphant, exhausting end, New York City emerged as the undisputed capital of the world. The post-war economic boom brought an unprecedented wave of prosperity, massive crowds, and a renewed sense of boundless optimism to the metropolis. The dark, terrifying days of wartime blackouts were replaced by the brilliant, buzzing neon lights of Times Square. The mysterious individual who had threatened the Consolidated Edison Company before the war was entirely forgotten, buried deep beneath years of global trauma and thousands of unread police files. The NYPD had convinced themselves that the author of those meticulous letters was either dead, incarcerated for another crime, or had simply abandoned his twisted crusade. But the entity known as FP was a man of immense, terrifying patience. He had not forgotten his grievance. He had simply been waiting for the world to return to normal so he could tear that normalcy to absolute shreds. On March 29, 1951, the fragile peace of the post-war era was violently, explosively shattered. Grand Central Terminal, the absolute beating heart of the city's transit system, was swarming with tens of thousands of commuters rushing home during the evening rush hour. Without a single warning, a deafening, concussive roar echoed through the massive, cavernous concourse. A pipe bomb, infinitely more sophisticated and powerful than the crude devices of 1940, had detonated with terrifying force inside a sand urn near the Oyster Bar. Smoke instantly filled the air, mixing with the panicked, hysterical screams of thousands of terrified citizens. Miraculously, no one was killed in the blast, but the psychological damage was instantaneous and absolute. The police rushed to the scene, cordoning off the shattered marble and twisted metal, entirely bewildered by the random nature of the attack. But the bomber did not leave them in the dark for long. Shortly after the explosion, a letter arrived at a local newspaper, penned in those unmistakable, blocky capital letters. The Phantom proudly claimed responsibility for the Grand Central detonation, reminding the city that his war against Consolidated Edison was back on and that the public was now considered collateral damage. This marked a terrifying, fundamental shift in the bomber's methodology. He was no longer leaving duds on the windowsills of corporate buildings. He was actively detonating highly lethal devices in the most crowded, vulnerable public spaces on Earth. The Phantom had transitioned from a corporate saboteur to an urban terrorist. As 1951 bled into 1952, the pace and the brazenness of the attacks violently escalated. Bombs began exploding with terrifying regularity. They detonated in the heavy, coin-operated public lockers at Penn Station. They blew up in the crowded, claustrophobic phone booths of the Port Authority bus terminal. The sheer, unpredictable randomness of the locations generated an atmosphere of absolute, suffocating paranoia across all 5 boroughs. New York City is a metropolis built entirely on the concept of shared public space, and the bomber had successfully turned that fundamental architecture into a terrifying weapon. But the absolute pinnacle of this psychological warfare was achieved when the bomber specifically targeted the darkest, most vulnerable spaces in the city, the movie theaters. FP began slicing open the heavily upholstered seats of massive, crowded cinemas like the Paramount Theater and Radio City Music Hall, slipping his ticking pipe bombs deep inside the cushions and sewing them back up. Imagine the profound, visceral terror of sitting in a dark theater, surrounded by hundreds of people, completely unable to see what is directly beneath you. When these hidden devices detonated during crowded evening screenings, sending shrapnel and stuffing tearing through the darkness, the resulting stampedes and hysteria were apocalyptic. You could no longer leave your luggage in a locker. You could no longer make a private phone call. You could no longer seek escapism in a dark movie theater without frantically checking beneath your seat. The press, capitalizing on the immense, city-wide panic, christened the unknown assailant the Mad Bomber, a moniker that perfectly captured the terrifying reality of a metropolis being held hostage by a ghost. The NYPD was facing a public relations nightmare and an impossible, invisible enemy, and they were rapidly running out of time. As the 1950s progressed, the reign of the Mad Bomber transformed from a localized police issue into a massive, citywide state of emergency. The New York Police Department, operating under the crushing, relentless pressure of a terrified public and a furious mayoral administration, launched the most extensive, frantic manhunt in the entire history of the city. The legendary NYPD bomb squad was expanded into a massive, dedicated task force. Their sole directive was to unmask the entity known as FP before a massive, catastrophic loss of life occurred. But the detectives were fighting an entirely new breed of criminal. FP was a true ghost in the machine of the metropolis. He left absolutely no fingerprints on his devices. He completely avoided the use of the postal system's saliva-sealed envelopes, ensuring no biological trace was left behind. His bombs were constructed from universally available, untraceable hardware store components, standard brass pipes, common pocket watch timers, and basic flashlight batteries. There was absolutely zero physical evidence for traditional law enforcement to trace. In the absence of physical clues, the police turned their desperate attention to the bomber's only tangible connection to the world: his endless, taunting letters. FP was a prolific, obsessive writer. He routinely sent letters to the major New York newspapers, the police commissioner, and even the executives of Consolidated Edison, boasting about his explosions, outlining his profound, twisted grievances against the utility company, and promising even greater devastation. Every single letter was meticulously crafted. There were never any spelling errors. The punctuation was flawless. The block handwriting was so incredibly precise and uniform that it resembled the work of a mechanical drafting machine rather than a human hand. The NYPD formed a specialized unit that did nothing but sift through literally millions of handwriting samples. They legally compelled Consolidated Edison to open their massive employee archives, desperately searching through decades of employment records, complaint forms, and termination files, hoping to find a single document that matched the flawless, blocky script of the Mad Bomber. This massive, bureaucratic dragnet resulted in thousands of false leads and completely innocent people being dragged into interrogation rooms. The police were operating purely on exhaustion and desperation. They set up massive, highly visible cordons around major landmarks, deployed hundreds of undercover officers into the subways and movie theaters, and instituted random, highly invasive bag checks across the city. But the Mad Bomber was always one step ahead. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of police movements, striking in Brooklyn when the heavy patrols were focused in Manhattan, and detonating devices in the Bronx when the task force was sweeping Queens. The economic toll on the city was staggering. The massive movie palaces of Times Square, once the crown jewels of New York entertainment, were losing millions of dollars in revenue as terrified citizens completely refused to sit in the dark. The city was bleeding, both financially and psychologically. By the winter of 1956, after 16 grueling years of explosions, the NYPD was forced to confront a deeply humiliating, terrifying reality. Traditional police work was utterly, fundamentally failing. They had analyzed the bomb fragments, they had read the letters, they had interrogated the suspects, and they were absolutely nowhere closer to catching the Phantom than they were on that cold afternoon in 1940. Inspector Howard Finney, the hardened, frustrated commander of the police crime laboratory, realized that analyzing the physical construction of the bombs was a dead end. They didn't need to understand how the bomb was built. They desperately needed to understand the mind of the man building it. Finney decided to cross a boundary that law enforcement had previously viewed with deep skepticism and contempt. He realized that to catch a monster who operated purely on psychological warfare, he needed to employ a psychological weapon. In a moment of absolute desperation that would permanently alter the course of criminal investigation, the NYPD decided to hand the evidence over to a psychiatrist. The man the New York Police Department turned to in their darkest hour was Dr. James A. Brussel, an esteemed, highly analytical clinical psychiatrist and the Assistant Commissioner of the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene. Dr. Brussel was not a detective. He possessed absolutely no formal background in police procedure or forensic science, but what he did possess was a profound, deeply intricate understanding of the fractured, chaotic landscape of the abnormal human mind. When Inspector Finney arrived at Dr. Brussel's office, he carried with him two massive, heavy boxes containing 16 years of absolute failure. Crime scene photographs of the shattered movie theaters, twisted fragments of brass piping, and most importantly, high-resolution copies of every single meticulously penned letter FP had ever sent. Finney laid the evidence out on the desk and asked the psychiatrist a question that seemed utterly impossible. By simply looking at the aftermath of the destruction, could he tell the police who was responsible? Dr. Brussel did not look at the evidence like a cop hunting for a fingerprint. He looked at it like a doctor examining a patient displaying severe, chronic symptoms. He spent hours intensely studying the crime scene photos, entirely ignoring the explosive damage and focusing intensely on the bomber's obsessive, flawless handwriting and his paranoid, grandiose language. Brussel noticed that the letters FP wrote were not the frantic scribbles of a raving lunatic. They were perfectly spaced, mathematically precise, and totally devoid of any emotional fluctuation. FP was a man who required absolute, rigid control over his environment. The psychiatrist deduced that the bomber's obsessive hatred of Consolidated Edison, a grievance he had nursed for over 16 years, was the hallmark of classic paranoia. Paranoiacs, Brussel knew, were deeply suspicious, fiercely intelligent, and completely incapable of letting go of a perceived injustice. They build massive, intricate internal worlds where they are always the victim. Based on this intense, pioneering psychological autopsy, Dr. Brussel began to construct a completely revolutionary tool for law enforcement, a criminal profile. He told the stunned detectives that the mad bomber was a man between the ages of 40 and 50, entirely self-educated, meticulously neat, and severely socially isolated. Brussel deduced that because the bomber's language was highly formal and lacked modern slang, he was likely an immigrant, specifically of Eastern European or Slavic descent. Because the bombs were built with an obsessive attention to symmetrical detail, the bomber would be unmarried, deeply repressed, and living with older female relatives who treated him like a child. Brussel asserted with absolute confidence that FP was indeed a former employee of Consolidated Edison, likely fired after a workplace accident that he believed had permanently ruined his health. He told the police to stop looking for a criminal mastermind in the dark alleys of the city and to start looking for a quiet, impeccably dressed loner living in a modest, rigorously clean home in Connecticut or Westchester County. But it was the absolute, final detail of Dr. Brussel's profile that cemented his place in the annals of criminal history and deeply shocked the hardened detectives sitting in his office. As Finney and his team gathered the files to leave, Dr. Brussel offered one final, highly specific, and seemingly psychic prediction. He looked the inspector dead in the eye and said, "When you finally catch him, and you will catch him, look at how he is dressed. He will be wearing a double-breasted suit, and it will be completely buttoned." The NYPD was entirely dumbfounded. They had spent over a decade looking for physical clues, and this doctor had just provided them with a highly detailed, living phantom based entirely on the shape of his handwriting and the nature of his grievance. Operating on pure faith and having absolutely no other options, the police decided to publish Dr. Brussel's complete psychological profile in the major New York newspapers on Christmas Day, 1956. They were laying a massive psychological trap. They were no longer hunting the mad bomber in the streets. They were hunting him in his own mind, waiting to see if the paranoiac would finally make a mistake. The decision to publish Dr. Brussel's profile was a desperate gamble, but it proved to be a masterful piece of psychological maneuvering. The NYPD, now working with a new kind of weapon, craftily leaked the profile not to the police reporters, but to the top-tier feature writers of the city's major newspapers, including the New York Journal-American. On Christmas Day, 1956, the mad bomber woke up to read his own reflection across the front pages. The headlines screamed not about his bombs, but about his mind. Mad bomber, a paranoiac loner, possibly an immigrant, sick, old, and frustrated. The articles detailed Dr. Brussel's conclusions regarding the meticulous nature of the letters, the obsessive need for control, and the deeply nursed grievance. The trap was laid, and it was based on a simple, clinical truth. A paranoiac cannot ignore his own reflection, especially when it is being critiqued. They were daring FP to correct them, to prove his superiority, and to finally break his mask. The response was almost immediate, and it came from the one entity FP valued more than anything else: his voice. Just days later, a letter arrived at the offices of the Journal-American. It was not a bomb threat, but a correction. FP wrote, "Dr. Brussel is a poor psychiatrist, but he is not the only poor one in the department. He is not close to the truth." He argued with the profile, contesting details about his health and his grievances. The bomber was engaging. He was responding. The NYPD's plan was working. The newspaper, directed by police, printed a clever follow-up article, thanking the mystery writer for his thoughtful correction and encouraging him to provide more details so they could better understand his position. The dialogue was open. The mad bomber, so used to the silence and terror of his explosions, was now caught in a conversation with the entire city, and he was too arrogant to realize the line was being reeled in. While FP was distracted by his duel with the press, the NYPD launched a parallel, invisible operation that would prove to be the ultimate breaker of the case. They realized that every one of the letters mentioned the grievance, and that every piece of physical evidence was untraceable. So they ignored the bombs and the letters and went to the only archive that could possibly hold a physical clue: Consolidated Edison itself. A newly formed special task force obtained a massive legal order to compel the company to immediately open its entire, vast employee complaint archives, stretching back 25 years. This was not a search for a criminal, but a hunt for a specific name and a specific complaint. They were looking for the dastardly deed FP referenced, a piece of corporate history that had birthed a monster. Millions of files were meticulously reviewed. The task force was drowning in bureaucratic paperwork and ancient dust, but they were fueled by the scent of an actual, tangible clue that could connect a ghost in the shadows to a specific file. A single clue that finally broke the 16-year-old case, the thread that would lead directly from a dusty file to a terrifying entity, was discovered not by a seasoned detective, but by a young junior accountant named Alice Kelly. In the sprawling, massive Consolidated Edison archives on West 14th Street, Alice was working alongside police, sifting through the seemingly endless piles of files, specifically focusing on compensation cases from the 1930s. Compensation files were an absolute bureaucratic nightmare, filled with obscure medical reports, dense legal arguments, and petty bureaucratic denials. Most of them were instantly dismissible. But in mid-January 1957, Alice Kelly pulled a manila folder from the very back of a bottom drawer. It was not thick, nor was it flagged in any specific way. She opened it and began to read a series of letters filed in 1931 and 1932. The handwriting on those yellowed, decades-old complaints was instantly recognizable. It was penned in those meticulous, blocky, mechanical capital letters that New York City had come to associate with absolute terror. The name on the file was George Metesky. The story it told was one of bureaucratic indifference and personal tragedy. Metesky had been a reliable, hard-working employee at Consolidated Edison's massive Hellgate plant in the Bronx for decades. In 1931, while Metesky was working inside a heavy turbine, a steam pipe exploded, filling his lungs with scalding, toxic steam. The resulting internal burns permanently ruined his health, rendering him completely unable to perform manual labor. He filed a routine, simple workman's compensation claim. He was a citizen with a family, a hard-working American who had been injured through no fault of his own. But Consolidated Edison, operating with a cold corporate efficiency typical of the era, did not see a loyal employee in crisis. They saw a financial liability. They utilized an obscure legal loophole. Because the complaint was filed a mere 3 days after the statutory limit of 1 year, they legally denied the entire claim, effectively cutting off his income, his health insurance, and his livelihood. They had applied a cold, legalistic technicality to a life-changing catastrophe, and in their corporate eyes, the file was closed. But for George Metesky, the file was just the beginning. The denial ignited a profound, all-consuming paranoia in his mind. He spent years writing meticulous letters to Consolidated Edison, pleading with the executives, detailing his deteriorating health, and begging for a simple hearing. They ignored him. They applied a secondary technicality to his subsequent complaints, effectively ensuring his requests were automatically dismissed by junior clerks without ever being seen by anyone with real authority. The corporate indifference was systematic. The bureaucracy was designed to be deaf to the pain it caused. And as each letter was filed away, unread, George Metesky's mind was fracturing. He ceased to be a simple victim. In his own fractured mind, he was becoming the hand of divine justice. FP was not born in a dark alley, but in the sterile, indifferent halls of a corporate headquarters, on the day a system decided to apply a technicality to a human being. Consolidated Edison had closed the file on George Metesky, and in doing so, They had unleashed the Mad Bomber. Alice Kelly immediately realized the profound significance of her discovery and handed the file to the head detective, who instantly ordered the absolute prioritization of this lead above all others. A specialized unit was formed to investigate the existence of George Metesky. They were no longer looking for a ghost. They had a name, a historical address, and a specific employer. The detectives descended upon the quiet neighborhoods of Waterbury, Connecticut, where the 1931 compensation file listed a small, meticulously neat single-family home. They set up surveillance, watching the house for days, but the property seemed eerie, silent, and entirely abandoned. The neighbors described a family of extreme introverts, 2 elderly sisters, and a middle-aged, reclusive brother who lived completely in isolation. They possessed 0 social life, 0 known friends, and 0 connections to the outside world. This was not a community. It was a sanctuary of paralyzing isolation. The reclusive man, who was only seen briefly on Sundays, matched Dr. Brussels' psychological profile with such terrifying, unmitigated precision that it sent a chill through the entire investigation. They had the suspect. The next step was to execute the takedown. The takedown of the Mad Bomber required meticulous tactical precision. The police were operating on pure intelligence. They possessed 0 physical evidence that George Metesky was the entity known as FP, or that any bombs were built in that house. If they executed a high-profile, aggressive raid and found nothing, the entire investigation would collapse. The NYPD waited for a specific, vulnerable moment. On January 21st, 1957, at 11:30 p.m., a heavily armed tactical unit surrounded the Waterbury home. Detectives did not smash down the door. They simply rang the doorbell. A quiet, impeccably neat man with a composed demeanor opened the door, entirely unbothered. Detectives instantly flooded the house and found the living spaces in a state of absolute, pathological cleanliness. George Metesky was captured without a single act of resistance. He did not yell, nor did he attempt to flee. Detectives immediately searched the premises and found the smoking gun. Hidden beneath a false bottom in a closet in a small bedroom was a fully operational construction shop. It was not a criminal's lair, but the perfectly ordered workbench of a master clockmaker. They found dozens of empty brass pipes, sorted watch timers, stacks of catalogued batteries, and most damning of all, a sheet of metal with those distinct, blocky capital letters meticulously cut out. The actual template used to sign every FP letter. But as the detectives processed the house, the head inspector stopped, a look of total, unmitigated shock on his face, as he remembered the absolute final detail of Dr. Brussels' unique prediction. He looked over at George Metesky, standing composedly in his own bedroom with a calm smirk on his face, and realized that the psychiatrist had been right down to the very last detail. George Metesky was wearing an impeccably tailored, double-breasted suit, and every single button was perfectly fastened. George Metesky's composed smirk never wavered, even as detectives showed him the evidence and officially announced his arrest. During the long car ride from Connecticut to Manhattan, he did not demand a lawyer. He demanded a cigarette, which he smoked with a calm satisfaction, as if he was an elite academic, waiting to present his dissertation to the press. Inside the smoke-filled interrogation room at police headquarters, Metesky did not offer a confession. He delivered an elaborate, exhaustive testimony. For over 16 grueling hours, he meticulously detailed the exact construction methodology of every single bomb he had ever built, catalogued the precise logic behind the selection of every crowded location, and proudly detailed his long game of cat and mouse with the NYPD. The Mad Bomber did not see a criminal act in the 16-year campaign of terror. He saw it as an unavoidable divine mission to provide justice, a campaign that was finally and successfully complete. He was not a suspect in the interrogation room. He was an auteur delivering the final edit of his magnum opus to a stunned audience. George Metesky's public performance was not a simple criminal narrative. It was a masterpiece of total, unmitigated paranoia. The press, capitalizing on the unparalleled spectacle of an urban terrorist delivering such precise, logical descriptions of divine justice, turned the subsequent public proceedings into an apocalyptic media circus. But when Metesky finally arrived in the massive criminal court of the city he had terrorized for 16 years, the ultimate, terrifying truth of his psychological landscape shattered any remaining legal matrix. During his psychiatric evaluation, the city-appointed medical panel came to an absolute, non-negotiable conclusion. George Metesky was not a genius criminal mastermind playing a unique game. He was a man permanently living in a deep, chaotic, paranoid abyss where his logic, though flawless, was built entirely on an impossible, catastrophic illusion. In a moment of profound, tragic justice, the New York Supreme Court did not find him guilty of serial murder and urban terror. They found him legally insane. George Metesky was not executed or caged like a standard, violent criminal. He was committed permanently, without any chance of release, to the highly secure, clinical-looking facilities of the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. And in a final, profound and poetic irony, the man who had successfully held the greatest city on earth in a state of terror by utilizing time, paranoia, and logic, spent the rest of his life in an absolute, profound silence and obscure invisibility. The city slowly forgot the name George Metesky, the massive movie palaces reopened, and the specific panic of 1956 evaporated into the pop culture history of true crime. But the deep, chaotic psychological matrix that FP had created did not fully dissolve until late 1973. At the age of 70, a fragile old man who had been in Matteawan for nearly 3 full decades was officially deemed no longer a danger, given an obscure medical discharge, and quietly disappeared into the absolute obscurity of a dingy residential home in rural New York State. He had written his own dramatic, bloody final edit in the archives, but the final act was the ultimate, profound tragedy. He was never fully caught by justice. He was only finally erased by time itself. Thank you for joining me in the deep shadows today to unseal this incredibly complex file from Wayne's archive. If this journey through time, paranoia, and classic true crime fascinated you, please do not leave without hitting that like button, ringing the notification bell, and most importantly, subscribing to the channel. The archive is vast, filled with countless more dramatic, unresolved files waiting to be unsealed in the near future. Until next time, keep your doors locked, stay out of the deep woods, and never, ever assume that you know what is hiding just beyond the light. We will see you in the next video.